The morning of February 14th, 1944, dawned over the Solomon Islands with deceptive calm, the kind of quiet that experienced combat pilots had learned to distrust. The Pacific sky stretched endlessly blue from horizon to horizon, unmarred by clouds or the contrails of distant aircraft, presenting a canvas of serene beauty that belied the brutal war being waged across these remote tropical waters. 3 Vought F-4U Corsair fighters cut through the thin air at 18,000 feet, their distinctive gull-winged silhouettes dark against the brilliant morning sun that climbed steadily from the eastern horizon. The temperature at this altitude hovered near freezing, perhaps 20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that ice crystals formed on the inside surfaces of canopies if pilots breathed too heavily. Yet inside the cramped cockpit of the lead aircraft, Lieutenant Commander James Sweat wiped sweat from his brow, his leather gloves dark with moisture, despite the cold that seeped through every gap in the canopy seal and every imperfection in the aircraft's weather stripping. His breath created small clouds of condensation that briefly obscured portions of his instrument panel before dissipating in the thin air that whistled through invisible cracks around the cockpit. The contradiction between external cold and internal heat was one of many discomforts pilots endured, the sun's rays turning metal cockpits into greenhouses even at altitudes where unprotected flesh would freeze in minutes. His 2 wingmen, Ensign Harold Bauer and Lieutenant William Popp, maintained tight formation on either side of Sweat's lead aircraft, their gull-winged silhouettes mirroring his own against the morning sun. Sweat glanced left through the scratched and oil-spotted plexiglass of his canopy, checking on Bauer's position with the automatic vigilance that became second nature to fighter pilots, who understood that situational awareness often meant the difference between survival and death. Bauer flew with characteristic precision, his aircraft positioned exactly where tactical doctrine demanded, 30 feet off the lead's left wing and slightly aft, close enough to provide mutual support, but far enough to avoid collision if turbulence or enemy action forced sudden maneuvers. Popp mirrored the formation on the right side, his Corsair equally steady, despite the occasional turbulence that buffeted the 3 fighters as they traversed invisible rivers of air flowing over the Pacific's vast expanse. The distinctive gull-wing configuration of the F-4U Corsair gave the aircraft an unmistakable profile that other pilots could identify instantly, even at great distances or in poor visibility. The wings angled sharply downward from the fuselage before sweeping upward again in a configuration that looked almost broken or misshapen to untrained eyes, a design compromise necessitated by the massive 13-foot propeller driven by the aircraft's powerful 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine. The engine itself dominated the forward fuselage, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each cylinder a precision-machined marvel of engineering that transformed high-octane aviation gasoline into the raw power that pulled these fighters through the sky at speeds that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. Some pilots called the Corsair ugly, its bent wings and long nose creating proportions that offended aesthetic sensibilities shaped by sleeker aircraft designs. Others called it beautiful in the way that purely functional machines can be beautiful, every curve and angle serving a specific aerodynamic or mechanical purpose. But all agreed it was a formidable fighting machine when flown by skilled hands, capable of diving faster than almost any other fighter in the sky, armed heavily enough to destroy bombers or ground targets with equal efficiency, and possessing enough range to escort strike packages deep into enemy territory and return home with fuel to spare. Each Corsair weighed over 9,000 pounds empty, more than 4 tons of aluminum alloy, steel fittings, rubber hoses, electrical wiring, and the 1,000 components that transformed raw materials into a combat aircraft. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and pilot, the weight climbed past 12,000 pounds, yet the powerful engine and efficient design allowed this mass to climb, turn, and fight with grace that belied its substantial bulk. 6 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing just outboard of the wingfold, could fire nearly 6,000 rounds per minute combined, each gun capable of spitting out 750 rounds per minute of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer ammunition in ratios carefully calculated to maximize effectiveness against various targets. The combined weight of fire from all 6 guns could saw through aircraft structures, puncture fuel tanks, destroy engines, and kill pilots with brutal efficiency when aimed with skill and fired at proper range. They had launched from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal 2 hours earlier, departing in the pre-dawn darkness when the air was cool and dense, providing maximum engine performance for the heavy takeoff. What had seemed, during the brief ing, like a straightforward reconnaissance mission, escort a photo reconnaissance aircraft over Japanese-held territory near Rabaul and return home before lunch, had already begun to unravel in the way that combat operations often did despite careful planning. The briefing had taken place at 0400 hours in a Quonset hut that smelled of stale coffee, aviation fuel residue tracked in on pilots' boots, and the persistent mildew that grew on everything in the humid Pacific climate, no matter how frequently surfaces were cleaned or treated with antifungal compounds. Their commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel whose face bore deep lines carved by too many missions flown, too many young pilots lost, too many letters written to families explaining how their sons had died bravely in service of their country, had spread reconnaissance photographs across a battered wooden table scarred by cigarette burns and coffee rings. The photographs showed fuzzy black and white images of harbors, airfields, and defensive positions, intelligence gathered at great risk by previous reconnaissance missions, and analyzed by specialists who spent their days hunched over light tables with magnifying glasses, counting aircraft and measuring dimensions of buildings to assess enemy capabilities. "We need updated intelligence on Japanese shipping movements in Simpson Harbor," the colonel had said, his finger tracing routes on a weather-stained map that showed the complex geography of the Solomon Islands chain with its countless inlets, bays, and potential anchorages. "The bomber boys are planning a major strike for next week, and they need to know what's sitting at anchor and exactly where the Japanese have been reinforcing their flak positions. Every anti-aircraft gun we don't know about is another bomber that might not come home, another crew that dies because we sent them in blind. The reconnaissance bird will make the photo runs at 20,000 feet. Your job is to keep any zeros off his tail long enough to complete the mission and get clean photographs that our analysts can use." Questions? Sweat had asked the obvious question about expected enemy fighter strength, the calculation that would determine whether 3 escorts represented adequate coverage or dangerous understrength. The intelligence officer, a young lieutenant fresh from stateside training who looked far too clean and fresh-faced for the brutal realities of Pacific combat, had consulted his typed notes and situation reports before responding with the confidence of someone whose information came from files rather than experience, probably light to moderate enemy air activity. "We've been hitting their airfields around Rabaul pretty hard for the past 2 weeks, and signals intelligence suggests they're critically low on experienced pilots. Most of their veterans were killed or wounded in earlier campaigns, and the replacements arriving from Japan have minimal flight hours. We estimate maybe 6 to 8 fighters at most, likely inexperienced pilots still learning their trade, nothing you gentlemen can't handle given your experience and aircraft capabilities." That assessment would prove catastrophically wrong within the next hour, but such was the nature of wartime intelligence. Educated guesses based on incomplete information gathered from sources of varying reliability and analyzed by people who did their best with imperfect data. The fog of war was not merely a poetic metaphor, but a concrete reality that obscured enemy intentions, capabilities, and dispositions with frustrating regularity, no matter how much effort went into intelligence gathering. Experienced pilots learned to trust their instincts, their training, and their wingmen more than intelligence reports that might be outdated before the ink dried on the paper or based on enemy deception operations designed specifically to mislead Allied planners. The reconnaissance aircraft, a modified B-25 bomber stripped of armament and fitted with specialized cameras capable of producing high-resolution imagery from 20,000 feet, had developed serious engine trouble 40 minutes into the flight. Sweat had watched black smoke begin trailing from the bomber's right engine, thick and dark against the morning sky, followed moments later by the pilot's radio transmission, reporting catastrophic oil pressure loss and the decision to abort the mission. The bomber had peeled away from formation, its pilot waggling his wings in the universal aviator's gesture of farewell and good luck, before beginning a gentle descent toward Henderson Field and the emergency crews that would be standing by after receiving the pilot's Mayday transmission. The departure of the reconnaissance aircraft left the 3 Corsairs alone over enemy-controlled waters, with their primary mission objective suddenly void, the escort task disappearing along with the aircraft they were supposed to protect. Standard procedure would dictate immediate return to base, preserving valuable fighters and experienced pilots for missions that actually served operational purposes. But Sweat faced a decision that transcended standard procedures, weighing tactical doctrine against operational needs and his own assessment of risks versus potential benefits. The photographs were desperately needed for planning the upcoming offensive against Rabaul, a major operation that would commit thousands of Marines and sailors to amphibious assault operations, where success or failure might hinge on accurate intelligence about enemy positions, defensive capabilities, and the current disposition of Japanese naval forces in the harbor. His commanding officer had emphasized the photograph's critical importance during the morning briefing, explaining how bomber crews would rely on this intelligence to plan their approach routes, identify primary and secondary targets, and avoid the heaviest concentrations of anti-aircraft fire. Without current reconnaissance, planners would have to rely on outdated information or accept significant intelligence gaps that translated directly into increased risk for every pilot and crew member participating in the strike. Sweat made his decision to continue the mission despite the reconnaissance aircraft's abort, though the deliberation required only seconds despite the complexity of factors involved in the choice. Intelligence suggested minimal Japanese air activity in the sector, though he treated such reports with the healthy skepticism born from experience with intelligence failures. The war in the Pacific had ground on for over 2 years and 3 months now, transforming from the shocking surprise of Pearl Harbor's burning battleships to a brutal slog across thousands of miles of ocean, each island a fortress defended by soldiers who fought with determination that sometimes crossed into fanaticism, each mile of ocean contested with blood, burning aviation fuel, and torn metal. Victory seemed increasingly inevitable as the American industrial machine churned out ships, aircraft, tanks, and weapons at rates that Japan's smaller industrial base could not hope to match. The statistics were overwhelming. American shipyards launched aircraft carriers faster than Japan could sink them. American factories produced fighters and bombers in numbers that replaced losses and expanded air groups simultaneously. American training programs graduated pilots by the thousands, while Japan's training infrastructure struggled to replace combat losses with adequately prepared replacements. But inevitable victory still required winning each individual battle, still demanded that someone fly these dangerous missions, take calculated risks, face enemy fire. If you're enjoying this detailed account of one of history's most improbable aerial victories and want to hear more incredible stories of courage and determination from World War II, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue researching and creating these in-depth narratives that honor the bravery of those who fought for freedom in humanity's darkest hour. Sweat's decision to continue reflected his understanding of this larger strategic context. Aborting meant intelligence gaps that operational planners would have to fill through guesswork, outdated information, or simply accept as unavoidable uncertainties that increased risks for everyone involved in subsequent operations. It meant Marines potentially landing on beaches without complete information about enemy positions and defenses. It meant bomber crews striking targets without current reconnaissance showing where the Japanese had repositioned anti-aircraft batteries or concentrated their defensive fighters. The mission mattered in ways that transcended the immediate tactical situation, connecting to broader operational objectives and ultimately to the war's outcome. His father's words echoed in his memory, advice given on a warm California evening years before the war, back when Sweat was 15 and struggling with a school bully who had been making his life miserable through constant harassment and threats. They had been sitting on the back porch steps while fireflies danced in the gathering darkness, and his mother worked in the kitchen, unaware of the conversation taking place outside. "Sometimes running is smart, son," his father had said, speaking with the measured cadence of someone choosing words carefully because he understood their importance. "There's no shame in tactical retreat when you're genuinely outmatched, when staying means pointless sacrifice without accomplishing anything useful. Smart people know when to withdraw and fight another day. But sometimes you have to stand your ground even when the odds look bad, even when every calculation suggests you should retreat, because other people are counting on you to be there, to do your part, to not let them down when it matters most. You have to look inside yourself in those moments and decide what kind of man you want to be, what values you'll uphold, even when upholding them costs you something." His father had been a World War I veteran, gassed in the trenches of France during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, invalided home with lungs that never quite recovered, spending the rest of his life dealing with the consequences of that exposure. Those words carried the weight of experience earned through suffering, wisdom purchased at a price that transcended mere intellectual understanding. Sweat keyed his radio, his voice steady despite the decision's weight, and his awareness of the risks involved in continuing without the reconnaissance aircraft they were supposed to escort. "Stay tight on me," he transmitted, the words economical, as radio discipline demanded. "Check your ammunition counters and fuel gauges. We're going to complete this reconnaissance run ourselves. Get the intelligence the brass needs. If we spot heavy enemy activity, we'll photograph what we can and get out fast, but we're not going home empty-handed if there's any way to bring back useful information." Bauer's response came immediately, his voice carrying undertones of both concern and acceptance, the mixture of emotions that experienced combat pilots learned to manage when orders contradicted prudence. "Roger that, Skipper. Following your lead." Pop's acknowledgement followed seconds later, equally professional despite the obvious implications of proceeding deeper into enemy-controlled airspace without the numbers that doctrine suggested for offensive operations in contested zones. "Understood, boss. Right wing's with you all the way." The three Corsairs continued northward, climbing gradually to conserve fuel while gaining altitude that could be traded for speed if combat developed, each 1,000 feet of elevation representing potential energy that physics would convert to velocity in a dive. The ocean below stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface transformed by morning sunlight into a sheet of hammered metal that reflected brilliance too intense to look at directly without squinting. Occasional whitecaps marked areas where wind patterns created rougher surface conditions, while smooth patches indicated calmer waters, where currents and wind aligned rather than conflicted. Sweat performed his ritual checks with practiced efficiency, eyes scanning instruments in a pattern burned into muscle memory through hundreds of hours of flight time. Fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, adequate for another 90 minutes of flight time under current power settings, longer if they reduced throttle settings to maximize range, though reduced speed would leave them vulnerable if combat developed. Ammunition counters displayed full loads in all 6 50 caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, 1,800 rounds total of mixed armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer ammunition ready to fire on command. Oil pressure gauge, needles rested steady in the green arc that indicated normal operating parameters. Engine temperature gauge showed acceptable cylinder head temperatures, the cooling system managing the engine's waste heat effectively despite the demands of sustained high-altitude flight. Everything mechanical functioned exactly as designed, yet something about the morning felt subtly wrong in ways Sweat couldn't articulate but couldn't ignore. Perhaps it was the absolute silence of the radio frequencies they monitored, with none of the usual chatter from other aircraft or ground controllers that normally filled the airwaves during daylight operations. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight seemed too bright and too sharp, as if atmospheric conditions had somehow intensified its brilliance beyond normal parameters. Perhaps it was simply the veteran combat pilot's instinct that developed after enough missions, enough close calls, enough moments where survival hinged on noticing subtle wrongness before it materialized into lethal threat. Whatever the source, unease gnawed at the edges of Sweat's concentration, even as he maintained his professional scan of sky and instruments. 20 minutes passed in relative calm, the 3 Corsairs continuing their northward course, while Sweat periodically consulted his navigation chart and estimated their position based on time, speed, and heading. Navigation over the open ocean required dead-reckoning skills honed through practice and cross-checked against sun position, estimated wind drift, and whatever landmarks became visible as they approached island chains. Modern radio navigation aids existed, but couldn't always be trusted in combat zones where the Japanese operated jamming equipment designed to deceive Allied navigators. Experienced pilots learned to trust their charts, their calculations, and their judgment more than electronic systems that might be feeding them deliberately false information. Bauer's voice shattered the morning calm with urgency that made Sweat's hand instinctively tighten on his control stick, and his eyes snap upward toward the sky above them. Contact, 12 o'clock high, multiple bogies inbound. Sweat's gaze swept the brilliant blue dome above their flight, initially seeing nothing but undifferentiated azure. Then the glints appeared. Tiny reflections of sunlight on polished metal or painted surfaces, like stars materializing in reverse as they descended from higher altitude, each glint representing an aircraft whose identity and intentions remained uncertain for the few seconds. It took Sweat's experienced eye to analyze their formation, flight characteristics, and profile. His stomach tightened as the count grew. 5 aircraft, then 10, then 15, finally stabilizing at 20 distinct contacts, all clearly fighters based on their size and the way they moved through the sky with the purposeful grace of predators rather than the steadier, more predictable flight of bombers or transport aircraft. 20 enemy fighters, almost certainly Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, based on their distinctive silhouettes even at this distance, the low-wing monoplane configuration, and relatively light construction, creating a profile that experienced pilots recognized instantly. The mathematical reality of the tactical situation crashed down on Sweat with the weight of cold calculation. 3 friendly fighters against 20 enemy fighters represented odds of nearly 7-1, numbers so overwhelmingly unfavorable that any tactical manual would recommend immediate disengagement before the enemy could establish favorable positioning. The A6M0 had earned a fearsome reputation in the Pacific War's early years, its combination of lightweight, powerful engine, and expert construction producing a fighter that could outturn almost anything in the sky. Japanese pilots flying Zeros had achieved air superiority over vast areas of the Pacific in 1941 and 42, shooting down Allied fighters with a skill and efficiency that shocked military planners who had underestimated Japanese capabilities. The Corsair possessed advantages that offset the Zero's maneuverability, particularly superior speed in level flight, and devastating performance in dives, where its heavier weight and more powerful engine translated to velocities the lighter Zero couldn't match. American tactical doctrine emphasized using these advantages, diving on enemy fighters from altitude, making a single high-speed pass, then using superior speed to disengage before the Japanese could bring their maneuverability advantages to bear in turning combat. But that doctrine assumed relatively equal numbers, or at least odds, that gave American pilots reasonable chances of survival. 7-1 odds made survival questionable under any circumstances. Every fiber of Sweat's training screamed to push the stick forward, roll inverted, and dive away at maximum speed, using the Corsair's superior dive performance to open distance before the Zeros could react and pursue. At this altitude and with their current energy state, the three Corsairs could probably escape, trading altitude for speed in a power dive that would leave the slower diving Zeros behind, returning to Henderson Field alive to fight another day when circumstances might favor survival rather than suicide. Tactical retreat represented the smart choice, the logical choice, the choice that preserved valuable aircraft and irreplaceable experienced pilots for missions where they had reasonable chances of accomplishing objectives without certain death. But diving away meant abandoning their reconnaissance mission entirely, returning empty-handed with no intelligence gathered, no photographs captured, no useful information for the operational planners, who desperately needed current data about enemy dispositions. More critically, from Sweat's perspective, diving meant leaving 20 Japanese fighters free to continue their patrol unmolested, free to hunt for other American aircraft, free to strafe American ground positions or attack American shipping, free to kill American soldiers and sailors who depended on fighter pilots to contest control of the skies above the Pacific's contested islands and waters. Sweat keyed his radio, making the decision in a fraction of a second, though its implications would echo through the rest of his life, regardless of whether that life continued for hours or decades. His voice emerged steady despite his racing heart and the adrenaline already flooding his system as his body prepared for combat. "Stay tight. Check your ammunition. We're going in." The words sounded calm, almost casual, as if he were suggesting a minor course correction rather than a deliberate choice to engage overwhelming odds in combat that would probably kill all three of them. Bauer's response came after a pause, just long enough to convey surprise and concern without quite crossing into insubordination or questioning orders. "You sure about this, Skipper?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the unspoken implications about survival probability and the value of 3 experienced pilots against 20 enemy fighters whose destruction or distraction might not justify the likely cost. Sweat couldn't articulate the complex calculus that had led to his decision in the seconds available before the tactical situation evolved beyond the point where choices remained meaningful. He couldn't explain the mixture of duty, training, professional pride, tactical assessment, and something deeper that transcended rational calculation, something about the fundamental unwillingness to yield sky to an enemy that had launched its Pacific War with a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor that killed thousands and destroyed a significant portion of America's Pacific Fleet. He couldn't express the way his father's words echoed in memory, the lesson about standing ground when others depended on you even when the cost appeared prohibitive. Instead, he said simply, "We've got altitude advantage and about 30 seconds of surprise before they spot us. Make them count." Then he pushed his control stick forward smoothly but firmly, not jerking the controls, but applying steady pressure that rolled the Corsair inverted and pointed its nose toward the enemy formation 15,000 feet below. The aircraft responded instantly, the way it always did when properly maintained and flown within its performance envelope. That magical coordination between pilot intention and machine response that made flying feel like thought made physical. The Corsair's powerful engine roared as gravity and thrust combined to accelerate the fighter downward at terrifying speed. Wind screamed past the canopy with rising pitch as velocity increased, the sound penetrating the cockpit, despite insulation, and creating a howl that pilots learned to interpret like music, reading airspeed and stress levels in the wind's voice. The altimeter unwound in a blur, numbers spinning backwards so fast they became almost illegible, marking their descent toward the enemy formation with mechanical precision. G-forces built steadily as the dive steepened, pressing Sweat hard against his seat with increasing pressure that made breathing require conscious effort and turned simple movements into exercises against invisible weights. Behind him, Bauer and Pop followed in perfect formation despite the stress and violence of the dive, trusting their leader even into what appeared to be certain death, demonstrating the faith and leadership that combat forges between pilots who fly together, fight together, and understand that survival often depends on trusting the judgment of whoever occupies the lead position. Their Corsairs remained locked in position relative to Sweat's aircraft, 3 fighters diving together toward 20 enemies in a maneuver that appeared suicidal to any rational observer, but represented calculated aggression to pilots who understood that initiative and surprise could temporarily offset numerical inferiority. The Zero formation flew in a loose V pattern typical of Japanese patrol formations. The aircraft spread out enough to provide mutual coverage while maintaining visual contact between elements. They appeared to be conducting a standard combat air patrol, likely searching for American aircraft operating in their sector, or American shipping that might be attempting to resupply forward positions under cover of fighter protection. Their attention focused downward toward the ocean surface, where American destroyers sometimes appeared like gray ghosts, fast and deadly, rather than upward where threats might materialize from the sun's blinding glare. Sweat selected his target carefully during the dive. professional judgment operating at speeds that felt instantaneous but reflected hundreds of hours of training and combat experience. He chose the rightmost aircraft in the formation, slightly separated from the others by perhaps 200 feet, far enough that destroying it might not immediately alert the other pilots, but close enough that they would notice quickly once the attack developed. The isolation made it the optimal target for an opening attack that needed to achieve surprise and score kills before the Japanese realized they were under attack and scattered into defensive maneuvers. He aligned his gun sight, the illuminated reticle floating in space ahead of his canopy, compensating almost subconsciously for the angle of his dive, the target's forward motion, and the ballistic drop of bullets fired at these ranges. His hands moved with practiced precision born from countless hours of gunnery practice and dozens of combat missions where shooting accurately meant survival and missing meant death. Distance closed rapidly as the dive continued, the target growing from a distant speck to a clearly identifiable aircraft with visible national insignia and individual markings. At 800 yards, Sweat opened fire. The 650 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously with a combined roar audible even over the engine and wind howl. The recoil forces transmitted through the airframe, making the entire aircraft shudder rhythmically. Tracers arced through the intervening space, appearing to move slowly at first due to perspective and distance, then seeming to accelerate as visual reference points changed. Sweat walked his fire onto the target using small control inputs to adjust his aim, feeling the Corsair shudder as the guns consumed ammunition at their combined rate of nearly 6,000 rounds per minute, emptying his ammunition bays with mechanical efficiency. The Zero appeared to shudder as bullets struck home, pieces of its wing tearing away and tumbling through the air like leaves in a hurricane. Black smoke poured from its engine cowling, the characteristic signature of catastrophic mechanical damage, possibly a ruptured oil line or punctured cylinder that turned lubricant into smoke, while the engine tore itself apart without proper cooling. The aircraft rolled inverted in what might have been a deliberate maneuver or might have been loss of control, then fell toward the ocean far below in a death spiral that would end in violent impact with the water's surface. The element of surprise evaporated instantly, dissipating like morning fog under direct sunlight. The remaining 19 Zeros scattered explosively, their pilots reacting with the skill and training that had made them masters of Pacific airspace in the war's early years, even if most of them were replacement pilots with less experience than the veterans they'd replaced. But surprise had given Sweat and his wingmen one crucial advantage beyond the initial kill. They had established the engagement's terms, forcing the Japanese to react to American aggression, rather than executing their own planned attack on their own timeline. Bauer scored hits on a second Zero as he pulled out of his dive, his 6 guns converging fire on a target that had broken left in evasion, but not quite fast enough or far enough. Pieces flew from the Zero's tail section and smoke appeared, though the aircraft continued flying with its formation, the pilot either remarkably skilled or remarkably lucky in keeping his damaged fighter airborne, despite structural damage that would ground the aircraft permanently if he managed to survive long enough to land it. Pop's burst went wide as his target broke hard right with reflexes that saved the Japanese pilot's life by fractions of a second. The difference between bullets passing through the space where the aircraft had been moments earlier and actually striking the Zero's vulnerable structure. Combat often came down to such tiny margins, microseconds of timing or inches of position, that separated life from death in ways that felt random but actually reflected the cumulative effects of skill, experience, luck, and 1,000 tiny factors that combined to determine outcomes. Then the fight dissolved into chaos, 3-dimensional chess played at 300 miles per hour with death as the penalty for mistakes, both sides maneuvering violently to gain firing positions while denying their opponents the same opportunities. Sweat pulled hard on the stick, hauling the Corsair through a punishing 8G turn that grayed his vision and squeezed air from his lungs, his body weight increasing eightfold as physics exerted its inexorable laws. 2 Zeros flashed past his canopy close enough that he could see individual details, their red national insignia standing out against light-colored paint schemes, perhaps only 50 feet separating the aircraft, in a near miss that, under different circumstances, might have resulted in mid-air collision and guaranteed death for both pilots. He rolled inverted, dove again to build energy, then pulled up sharply in a reversal that bled airspeed but repositioned his aircraft to threaten Zeros that had been positioning behind him. The Corsair's superiority in speed and dive performance gave him options the lighter Zeros lacked, the ability to use vertical maneuvers to escape turning fights where their superior maneuverability would otherwise prove decisive. But the Zero's legendary ability to outturn almost any Allied fighter meant they could point their noses and guns at him while he was still completing wider turns, a capability that demanded constant vigilance and creative maneuvering to avoid presenting them with stable firing solutions. Tracer fire crossed the sky in every direction, streams of glowing death searching for metal and flesh with mechanical indifference to the human beings piloting the aircraft. Sweat saw one Zero explode in midair, the aircraft disintegrating into an orange-red fireball that briefly illuminated the morning sky before dissipating into a black scar that would fade within seconds. The kill belonged to either Bauer or Pop. He couldn't determine which in the chaos and didn't particularly care about scoring individual credits when survival demanded his complete attention. But the small victory meant little, strategically, because the numbers still favored the Japanese overwhelmingly. 18 against 3. The odds had improved fractionally, but remained fundamentally hopeless. The radio crackled with urgent transmissions, voices strained with G-forces and adrenaline. Pop's transmission cut through, tight and controlled, but carrying undertones of desperation. 3 on my 6, can't shake them, taking hits. Bauer's immediate response demonstrated the kind of tactical awareness and mutual support that kept fighter pilots alive in impossible situations. Coming around? Hold on, Bill. 10 seconds. Sweat reversed his turn aggressively, scanning frantically through his canopy for Pop's aircraft in the swirling chaos of turning, diving, climbing fighters. He found it 4,000 feet below, diving steeply with 3 Zeros in close pursuit, their wing-mounted guns flashing as they fired long bursts at the fleeing American fighter. Pop's Corsair jinked violently left and right, the pilot using every ounce of his skill to avoid the converging streams of fire while maintaining the dive that represented his best chance at escape. The desperate gamble that his aircraft's superior dive speed would pull him away before accumulated damage forced him down. Sweat made instant tactical calculations that combined physics, geometry, and learned intuition about aircraft performance and relative velocities. He rolled inverted and dove again, pushing the Corsair toward and beyond the edge of its performance envelope, building speed until the aircraft shuddered on the edge of compressibility. That dangerous realm where aerodynamic forces on control surfaces became so great that pilots sometimes couldn't overcome them with physical strength, where shock waves formed on wings and could cause catastrophic structural failure. He came down on the trailing Zero from above and behind, achieving the perfect firing position that every fighter pilot dreamed of, the classic bounce from altitude where physics and geometry combined to create situations where the target had no warning and minimal options for escape. His burst was short and precise, no more than 2 seconds of trigger time, but at this range, with 6 heavy machine guns creating a cone of converging fire, 2 seconds represented eternity. The Zero's canopy shattered spectacularly, pieces of plexiglass spinning away in the slipstream, and the aircraft nosed over into a vertical dive that would continue until it struck the ocean at terminal velocity, a dive from which no recovery was possible, whether the pilot was dead, unconscious, or simply too injured to manipulate controls. But saving Pop cost Sweat his situational awareness, that crucial mental picture of where every aircraft existed in the three-dimensional battle space, where threats were developing and where opportunities might exist. Combat awareness required constant updates, continuous scanning and assessment to maintain the mental model that separated experienced fighter pilots from novices who fixated on single targets and died when threats materialized from unexpected angles. He pulled out of his dive and immediately found himself surrounded by enemy fighters, his focus on saving his wingmen creating the momentary distraction that allowed others to position against him. Zeros above him, below him, to both sides, their pilots working with practiced coordination to box him in, to deny him the speed and vertical maneuverability that kept Corsairs alive when fighting more maneuverable opponents. His mouth went dry despite the cold, fear transmuting into heightened alertness and sharpened reflexes, his body's emergency systems flooding him with chemicals that enhanced performance even as they prepared him for potential death. This was it, the moment every fighter pilot feared regardless of experience or previous survival, when superior numbers and coordinated tactics negated individual skill and machine performance, when the mathematics of combat became inescapable. Cannon shells from a Zero's wing-mounted 20mm gun stitched across his right wing, the heavier weapons that Japanese fighters carried specifically for engaging bombers and heavily armed fighters, punching holes through aluminum skin and leaving jagged tears that streamed vapor as ruptured fuel cells began leaking their contents into the slipstream. Sweat's instrument panel illuminated like a Christmas tree, warning lights flashing urgent red messages about systems damage and imminent failures. Hydraulic pressure dropping steadily as fluid leaked from damaged lines. Fuel pressure fluctuating as the gravity feed system struggled to compensate for damaged cells and disrupted fuel flow. Oil temperature rising as the cooling system lost efficiency, the engine beginning its slow march toward seizure or fire. The Corsair was hurt, bleeding vital fluids into 300-mile-per-hour slipstream, and hurt aircraft didn't stay airborne indefinitely. Mechanical systems tolerated damage only to the point where critical components failed completely, where hydraulic pressure dropped too low to move control surfaces, where engines overheated past their limits and destroyed themselves in cascades of molten metal and burning oil. He had minutes at best before something failed catastrophically, maybe only seconds if the damage was worse than his instruments revealed, or if another burst found his aircraft's remaining vulnerable systems. He did the only thing possible under circumstances that offered no good options, something so aggressive and unexpected that it bordered on insanity, the kind of maneuver that tactical manuals would call reckless if it failed and brilliant if it succeeded. Instead of trying to escape, instead of using his remaining energy to dive away from the encircling Zeros, he turned directly toward the nearest enemy aircraft, closing the distance between them at a combined speed exceeding 600 miles per hour, deliberately initiating the head-on pass that pilots normally avoided because of collision risks and the brief firing windows it created. It became a deadly game of chicken played at altitudes where mistakes meant death, two fighters hurtling toward each other with guns blazing, each pilot betting his life that the other would flinch first, that survival instinct would overcome training and discipline at the last possible instant before catastrophic collision. Bullets from both aircraft crossed in the intervening space, tracer streams marking their paths like malevolent searchlights, physics and ballistics, combining to create brief windows where lead and steel filled the air between rapidly converging machines. The Zero broke first, the Japanese pilot's nerve cracking under the pressure of imminent collision with an American fighter whose pilot seemed willing to accept mutual destruction rather than yield position. The Zero rolled desperately away at what must have been the last possible instant, its pilot's reflexes and skill barely sufficient to avoid impact by margins measured in feet. Sweat passed through the gap created by the Zero's evasion, experiencing a moment of strange calm in the heart of chaos, then rolled and dove again, using gravity to restore the speed bled away in turning combat and aggressive maneuvering. More warning lights flashed across his instrument panel, red and yellow and amber indicators marking system failures and degraded performance. The engine vibration had increased noticeably, a roughness that suggested serious internal damage, possibly damaged bearings or bent connecting rods, mechanical failures that would eventually lead to complete seizure or fire. How much longer would it hold together under combat power settings? How much more punishment could the aircraft absorb before something critical failed completely? These questions had no answers beyond educated guesses based on experience and hope that mechanical tolerances would hold just a little longer. Bauer's voice cut through the radio chaos, his words measured despite the desperate circumstances unfolding around all three American pilots. "Skipper, I'm Winchester, completely out of ammunition." The call meant he was defenseless, unable to contribute to the fight except as a target and distraction, his 6 guns empty after burning through his full ammunition load in sustained bursts during the chaotic combat. But before Sweat could respond or begin formulating orders about how to extract from the engagement, Bauer continued with words that demonstrated the courage that defined the best military service. "But I'm not leaving the fight. I'll draw them off best I can. You and Pop make for home while I keep them busy." The nobility of the offer struck Sweat with almost physical force. Bauer was volunteering to sacrifice himself, to use his unarmed aircraft as bait while his wingmen escaped, accepting almost certain death so 2 others might live. It represented selfless courage of the highest order, the willingness to lay down one's life for comrades without hesitation or expectation of reward, the kind of sacrifice that military traditions honored across centuries and cultures. "Negative?" Sweat responded instantly, his voice hard with command authority that left no room for argument or discussion. "We stay together, we leave together, nobody gets left behind." The words emerged from somewhere deep in his character, from the values instilled by parents and teachers and training officers, from an unshakable conviction that leadership meant sharing danger rather than delegating it, that commanders who sent others to die while preserving their own safety forfeited the moral authority to lead. The fight continued through minutes that felt like hours, exhaustion beginning to fog thinking and slow reflexes, as adrenaline reserves depleted and muscles screamed protest against sustained high-G maneuvering. Sweat lost track of time, lost track of individual Zeros, fought on instinct and training him as conscious thought became increasingly difficult. His arms ached from wrestling the control stick through violent maneuvers that combined physical strength with fine motor control. His neck hurt from constantly craning to check his 6 o'clock position, maintaining the situational awareness that meant survival. Sweat soaked his flight suit completely despite the cold, running into his eyes and making grips slippery. His hands trembled with adrenaline overload and sustained muscle tension. Another Zero fell, victim of an impossible deflection shot by Pop that connected through skill or luck or divine intervention, putting bullets exactly where they needed to be, despite the difficult angle and the target's evasive maneuvering. The enemy aircraft tumbled through the sky trailing fire, its pilot either dead or unconscious, controls unresponsive, The machine transformed from deadly weapon to falling debris in the fraction of a second it took for critical systems to fail. 14 against 3 now, still impossible odds, but each small victory making the impossible slightly less so, shifting the mathematics incrementally toward survival. The fight had descended to lower altitudes during the sustained combat, down from 18,000 feet at initial contact to just 10,000 feet where air was thicker and Corsairs could use their superior power-to-weight ratio more effectively against the lighter but less powerful Zeros. Sweat glanced at his fuel gauge between tactical scans and felt his stomach clench. The needle rested just above the red line marking critical reserve, the fuel leak from battle damage and sustained combat power settings depleting his tanks far faster than normal cruise flight. He had perhaps 15 minutes of flying time remaining under current conditions, probably less if combat continued demanding full power settings and violent maneuvering that consumed fuel at prodigious rates. The others would be in similar situations, their fuel gauges showing similarly critical readings after the extended combat and the high power demands of combat maneuvering. Every turn, every climb, every dive at maximum power settings burned fuel that couldn't be replaced until they landed, assuming they survived long enough to reach friendly territory and put their damaged aircraft down on Henderson Field's coral runway. "We need to break contact," Sweat transmitted, the words tasting like defeat, even though tactical necessity demanded disengagement before fuel exhaustion forced them down in enemy territory or in the ocean, where survival prospects approached zero. "Form on me. We're heading south, full throttle. We've done all we can here." But the Zeros weren't willing to let them go easily. Having committed to the fight, having lost 6 of their original 20 aircraft to the Americans' guns, the Japanese pilots pressed their attack with renewed fury, determined to exact revenge for fallen comrades and unwilling to allow the audacious American fighters to escape after inflicting such losses. A Zero appeared directly ahead of Sweat with startling suddenness, the Japanese pilot either incredibly brave or tactically foolish, flying straight and level to initiate a head-on pass that gave both fighters equal opportunity to destroy the other. It was the ultimate test of nerve, 2 pilots flying directly at each other with guns blazing, betting their lives that their shooting would prove more accurate or their opponent's nerve would break first. Sweat fired instinctively, not bothering with careful aim, just pointing his nose at the enemy and holding down the trigger until his remaining ammunition exhausted itself. The Zero's guns flashed simultaneously, their larger 20mm cannon shells mixing with smaller caliber machine gun rounds to create a wall of lead filling the space between converging aircraft. For a fragment of a second that stretched subjectively into eternity, 2 streams of tracer fire converged in the space between the aircraft, then intersected at a point that meant one or both fighters would be destroyed in the next heartbeat. Sweat felt impacts, heard metal tearing with sounds that carried clearly into the cockpit, saw his instrument panel explode in a shower of glass fragments and electrical sparks. Something intensely hot touched his left shoulder, pain that blossomed from point of contact into agonizing waves that radiated through his entire upper body. His vision tunneled as shock threatened consciousness, blackness creeping in from the edges of his visual field as his brain struggled to process pain signals while maintaining the focus required to keep flying. He was hit, wounded, possibly dying depending on which blood vessels the round had severed and how much blood he was losing, but his hands stayed on the controls through pure muscle memory and stubborn refusal to quit while consciousness remained. The Zero flashed past his canopy so close he could see the pilot's face, could see the man's eyes wide with emotions that might have been fear or determination or acceptance of imminent death, a fellow human being caught in the same lethal geometry. Then the Zero was falling, mortally wounded by Sweat's burst, its pilot likely dead at the controls, or so badly injured that controlling the aircraft exceeded his remaining capabilities, and Sweat was somehow still flying, still alive, despite the wound and the damage and the odds that should have killed him multiple times over. "Boss, you're hit." Bauer's voice carried shock and concern that penetrated even through the pain that dominated Sweat's awareness. Sweat forced words through clenched teeth, barely managing coherent speech through the pain that seemed to intensify with each heartbeat as shock wore off and his nervous system fully registered the damage. Still flying, still in control, form up, and let's get the hell home. His left arm hung useless, either broken by the bullet's impact or nerve damage to the point where conscious commands couldn't make it respond. Blood spread across his flight suit, warm and sticky, soaking into fabric but not arterial, not the kind of pulsing spray that meant minutes to live unless immediate medical intervention stopped the bleeding. The 3 Corsairs turned south, toward friendly territory, toward home, toward Henderson Field with its medical facilities and relative safety. But the remaining Zeros followed in pursuit, their pilots unwilling to concede control of this airspace, unwilling to allow the Americans to escape after the damage they'd inflicted, willing to follow even toward American anti-aircraft defenses in their determination to finish what they'd started. The running fight continued for another 10 minutes that felt like hours, a desperate race where fuel reserves and ammunition and pilot endurance all approached exhaustion simultaneously. Pop called Winchester, his ammunition completely expended, his aircraft reduced to an expensive and vulnerable decoy. Sweat's own ammunition counters showed near zero, perhaps enough rounds for one final short burst, if he chose his moment perfectly, and had enough discipline to not waste precious bullets on low-probability shots. Only Bauer had any significant ammunition remaining, and even his reserves were down to a few hundred rounds, barely enough for 2 or 3 sustained bursts.